Chapter 1. The Grieving Widow. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way to St. Mary's Church, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones. The entire village had turned out for the funeral of Richard Blackwood, though whether from genuine grief or simple curiosity, she couldn't quite determine. Mr. Blackwood had been one of those wealthy industrialists who kept themselves rather apart from village life, preferring to observe St. Mary Mead from behind the imposing gates of Thornfield Manor, rather than participate in its daily rhythms. As Miss Marple slipped into a pew near the back, she couldn't help but notice the particular quality of the whispers that filled the church. There was something more than the usual funeral murmurs, an undercurrent of speculation that seemed to centre on the figure in black, seated in the front pew. Mrs. Lydia Blackwood sat with perfect posture, her black veil doing little to conceal her composed features. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 45, though the village gossips insisted she couldn't be a day over 40. Her marriage to Richard Blackwood 18 months ago had caused quite a stir, a man of 65 taking a wife 20 years. His junior was bound to set tongues wagging. The fact that she was his second wife, replacing the much-beloved first Mrs. Blackwood, who had passed away 3 years prior, had only added fuel to the fire. Throughout the service, Miss Marple observed the widow with her characteristic attention to detail. Mrs. Blackwood's black ensemble was impeccable. The dress, hat, and gloves, all of the finest quality. Yet there was something about them that struck Miss Marple as odd. The outfit had none of that slightly hurried, not quite right look that often characterized hastily purchased mourning clothes. These garments fit perfectly, as though they had been tailored well in advance. But it was Mrs. Blackwood's hands that truly caught Miss Marple's attention. Throughout the service, the widow's fingers moved steadily, working on what appeared to be a black shawl with an intricate pattern. The needles clicked softly, never faltering, never trembling with the emotion one might expect from a newly bereaved wife. Miss Marple, herself an accomplished knitter, recognized the complexity of the pattern, not something one would attempt while overcome with grief. As the service concluded and the congregation began to file out, Miss Marple noticed how skillfully Mrs. Blackwood avoided direct contact with her late husband's 3 adult children. James, Margaret, and Thomas Blackwood stood together, a united front of barely concealed hostility. When forced to acknowledge them, the widow offered only the briefest of nods before turning to accept condolences from other mourners. "Such a shock," murmured Mrs. Bantry, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow as they made their way out of the church. Dr. Haydock was only saying last week how well Richard looked for his age. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though I understand he suffered from a heart condition." "That's what she says." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, glancing toward the widow. "Though it's the first anyone's heard of it. Richard was always boasting about his health. Said he planned to live to 90, just to spite his children." She paused, then added, "Not that he meant it unkindly, of course. He was devoted to them, despite their differences." That afternoon, armed with a fruit cake from her kitchen, Miss Marple presented herself at Thornfield Manor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, showed her into the morning room where Mrs. Blackwood sat in a wing chair by the window, her knitting needles moving steadily through the black wool. "How kind of you to call, Miss Marple," the widow said, not looking up from her work. "Do sit down. I'm afraid I'm not quite up to the usual pleasantries, but I appreciate your thoughtfulness." "Not at all, my dear. I simply wanted to express my condolences. Such a terrible shock for you." "Yes, terribly unexpected," Mrs. Blackwood agreed, though her tone suggested she was reciting a required response rather than expressing genuine feeling. "Though I suppose it's a mercy, in its way." The doctor had recently diagnosed a progressive heart condition. At least Richard was spared a long decline. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed the slight hesitation before the widow mentioned the heart condition, as though she were choosing her words with particular care. "How distressing for you, though I must say you're bearing up remarkably well." "One must carry on," Mrs. Blackwood replied, finally looking up. Her eyes, Miss Marple noted, were clear and dry. "I find my knitting helps. It gives one something to focus on during difficult times." "What an unusual pattern," Miss Marple observed, leaning forward slightly. "I don't believe I've seen it before." "It's an old family design," Mrs. Blackwood explained, holding up the shawl. "Passed down through generations. We always work it during periods of mourning. Rather morbid, I suppose, but traditions can be comforting." As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, her gaze fell upon Mrs. Blackwood's work-basket. Partially concealed beneath several skeins of black wool was another piece of knitting, a scarf in the same distinctive pattern. What caught her attention was not the scarf itself, but the fact that it showed considerable progress. The wool, though black, had a slightly different texture from the shawl, suggesting it had been purchased at a different time. More significantly, the edges showed the slight curling that came from being worked on over several days, or even weeks. "How interesting that you'd already begun a mourning project," Miss Marple remarked casually. Mrs. Blackwood's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Oh, that? I started it for my aunt. She's been quite ill, poor dear. One likes to be prepared." The explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet something in the widow's tone struck a false note. Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathies and took her leave, her mind already turning over the peculiarities she had observed. Later that afternoon, she encountered Dr. Haydock outside the village shop. The doctor, who had been the Blackwoods' physician, looked troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "I suppose you've been to pay your respects." "Yes, indeed. Such a sad business." Mrs. Blackwood mentioned her husband's heart condition. Dr. Haydock frowned. "Did she now?" "That's curious. I examined Richard not 3 weeks ago for his life insurance renewal. I've seldom seen a man in better health for his age. Certainly no indication of any heart condition, progressive or otherwise." "How very odd," Miss Marple said softly. "Though perhaps he was seeing a specialist." "If he was, he never mentioned it to me. And Richard was always very open about his health, rather proud of it, in fact." The doctor shook his head. "The whole thing's dashed peculiar. Natural causes, of course. Classic presentation of acute myocardial infarction. But still." As Miss worked on before its stated purpose, and now a mysterious heart condition that the family doctor knew nothing about. In her experience, when so many small details didn't quite fit, it usually meant there was a larger pattern waiting to be discovered. And Miss Marple had always been rather good at recognizing patterns, whether in knitting or in human nature. Chapter 2, Suspicious Inheritance. The morning following the funeral brought an unseasonable warmth to St. Mary Mead, though the atmosphere at Thornfield Manor was decidedly chilly. Miss Marple, taking her customary walk past the manor gates, observed several motor cars parked in the drive, a clear indication that the reading of Richard Blackwood's will was about to take place. By tea-time, the news had spread through the village like wildfire. Miss Marple was not surprised when Dolly Bantry appeared at her cottage, fairly bursting with information. "My dear Jane, you'll never believe it," Dolly exclaimed, settling herself in the chintz armchair by the fire. "Margaret Blackwood invited me to be present. Moral support, you know. We were at school together. The whole thing was absolutely extraordinary." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands. Indeed. I suppose there were some surprises in the will. Surprises? It was a sensation. Richard has left practically everything to her. That woman... Dolly's indignation was palpable. The children get barely anything. James receives a modest annual income. Margaret gets her mother's jewellery. And poor Thomas, just a small trust fund that won't even see him through university properly. And Thornfield Manor? That's the worst part. She gets it all. The house, the grounds, everything. The Blackwood family home for 5 generations, and now it belongs to someone who's been in the family barely 18 months. Dolly paused to sip her tea, her hand trembling slightly with emotion. James was beside himself. He accused her, right there in front of Mr. Petherick and everyone, of manipulating his father. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured. "What did Mrs. Blackwood say to that?" She sat there cool as a cucumber, knitting that blessed black shawl of hers. Said Richard had made his wishes perfectly clear, and that she intended to honour them. Then she had the nerve to suggest the children were welcome to visit whenever they liked. Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "When was this new will drawn up?" "That's what makes it all so suspicious. Mr. Petherick, he's the family solicitor, you know, said it was done just 3 months ago. The previous will divided everything much more fairly among the children, with provisions for the widow, of course, but nothing like this." That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to her nephew Raymond's old school friend, now the librarian at St. Mary Mead's modest library. Miss Hartnell, a woman of advanced years with an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and traditions, greeted her warmly. "I wonder," Miss Marple began, after the usual pleasantries, "if you might help me with a rather unusual inquiry. I've come across a knitting pattern I don't recognize, and I believe it might have Welsh origins." She produced a sketch she had made from memory of Mrs. Blackwood's distinctive pattern. Miss Hartnell adjusted her spectacles and studied it carefully. "How extraordinary," she murmured. "I haven't seen this in years. It's called The Widow's Comfort, from a remote region in North Wales. My grandmother was from those parts, and she used to tell me about it." "What an evocative name," Miss Marple observed. "I suppose it was worked during times of mourning." "Well, yes and no." Miss Hartnell's voice dropped to a whisper, though they were alone in the library. "The pattern has a rather darker history. In the old mining communities, where men's work was dangerous and life expectancy short, wives would begin working this pattern when they sensed their husband's time was near. Some said it was a way of preparing for the inevitable, hence the widow's comfort. But there were other stories." "Other stories?" "Whispers that some women used the pattern as a sort of countdown, that they would begin it when they had decided their widowhood should commence, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained placid. "How very interesting. I don't suppose you know anything about Mrs. Blackwood's background?" "Now that you mention it, I believe she did say something about Welsh ancestry when she first came to the village. Maiden name was Morgan, I think. Common enough in Wales." The following morning brought another visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Thomas Blackwood, the youngest of Richard's children, appeared at her door looking haggard and distressed. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple," he began hesitantly. "But I don't know who else to talk to. The police think I'm being ridiculous, and my brother and sister are too angry to think clearly." "Come in, my dear boy," Miss Marple said kindly. "Tell me what's troubling you." Seated in her parlour, Thomas ran his hands through his hair in agitation. "It's about father. He was perfectly healthy until he married her. Then suddenly he started having these episodes. Dizzy spells, shortness of breath, chest pains. She insisted it was his heart. Wouldn't let him see Dr. Haydock any more. Said she knew a specialist in London. Did he see this specialist? That's just it. I don't think he ever did. She always had some excuse. The appointment was cancelled, or the doctor was away. Meanwhile, she was always fussing over him, making special teas, insisting he rest more. Thomas's voice broke slightly. Father was never the same after they married. It was like she was preparing him for death. What makes you say that? Little things. She redecorated his study in darker colours, said it was more restful. She had him update his will, insisted it was prudent at his age, and she was always knitting those morbid black things, even before he died. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You mentioned special teas. Did your father ever comment on them? He joked once that they tasted bitter, but she said it was the herbs, good for his heart. After that, he stopped mentioning it. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the small room. The worst part is, I found something in Father's desk after the funeral. A notebook where he'd been recording his symptoms. The last entry was the day before he died. He wrote that he felt strange after his evening tea, worse than usual. Do you still have this notebook? Lydia found me with it. She said it was too painful to keep such reminders, and threw it in the fire before I could stop her. His hands clenched into fists. She's already had him cremated, you know. Said it was his wish, but I never heard him mention it. Our family has always been buried in St. Mary's churchyard. After Thomas left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The pattern was becoming clearer, though not the one in her hands. Richard Blackwood had been a healthy man who developed mysterious symptoms after his marriage. His new wife, a former cardiac nurse with Welsh ancestry, had been working mourning patterns before his death. The will had been changed in her favour, and now the body had been cremated with unseemly haste. As if her thoughts had summoned him, Inspector Slack's car pulled up outside her cottage that afternoon. The inspector, never her greatest admirer, looked even more irritable than usual. There isn't. But I've received an anonymous letter suggesting Richard Blackwood's death deserves investigation. Waste of time, if you ask me. Natural causes doctor signed the certificate. But the chief constable knows the family, so here I am. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. An anonymous letter. What did it say exactly? Suggested we look into the widow's background. Claimed she might have helped her husband along, so to speak. Nonsense, of course. No evidence of foul play. Though with cremation, evidence would be rather hard to come by. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. Dr. Haydock says the cremation was arranged very quickly, too quickly to do proper toxicology, if we'd wanted to. But there was no reason to suspect anything at the time. That evening, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock taking his constitutional walk. She mentioned, quite casually, the inspector's visit. Slack came to see me too, the doctor admitted. Asked about the cremation. I told him what I told you. Richard was healthy as a horse last time I examined him, but his symptoms, as described by Mrs. Blackwood when she called me that night, were classic heart attack, textbook presentation. You didn't examine him yourself? She said he was already gone when she found him in his study. By the time I arrived, there was nothing to be done but confirm death and comfort the widow. He paused, looking troubled. Though now that questions are being asked, I remember thinking she was remarkably composed for someone who'd just found her husband dead. And she had all the paperwork for the cremation ready remarkably quickly. Said they'd discussed it, and these were his wishes. As Miss Marple prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the day's discoveries. Mrs. Blackwood had certainly been efficient, changing the will, isolating her husband from his regular doctor, arranging a swift cremation. And through it all, she had continued her knitting, working that ancestral pattern that might mean more than simple mourning. Opening her drawer, Miss Marple looked again at the sketch she had made of the pattern. In the lamplight, the intricate design seemed to take on new meaning. Was it merely a cultural tradition, or could it be something more sinister? Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay another visit to Thornfield Manor. There were questions that needed answering, and patterns that needed to be understood, before someone else fell victim to the widow's comfort. Chapter 3. The Coded Scarf. Miss Marple's correspondence was typically confined to family letters and the occasional note to old friends. But the morning post brought something quite different, a thick envelope bearing the seal of the British Museum. Inside was a detailed response from Dr. Eleanor Whitstable, an expert in historical textiles whom Miss Marple had contacted through a mutual acquaintance. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "your inquiry regarding the Welsh mourning pattern known as the Widow's Comfort has opened quite a fascinating can of worms. The pattern you sketched is indeed authentic, but I must tell you that its history is far more complex and darker than most modern knitters realize." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and continued reading with growing interest. In certain isolated Welsh communities, particularly in the mining regions of Gwynedd, this pattern had an alternative name, Gwedu Swiriant, literally, the widow's insurance. Local folklore suggests it was used not merely as a mourning craft, but as a means of encoding recipes for herbal preparations. The variations in the pattern, the placement of yarn overs, the number of decreases, the arrangement of cables, could represent different ingredients and their proportions. The letter went on to describe how certain combinations of herbs, including foxglove, belladonna, and mountain laurel, could mimic or induce heart conditions when administered over time. The brilliance of the system, Dr. Whitstable noted, lay in its perfect camouflage. To the uninitiated, it appeared to be nothing more than a complex knitting pattern passed down through generations of grieving women. Miss Marple set the letter aside thoughtfully. She was just considering her next move when a knock at the door announced Margaret Blackwood, looking pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced. I need to speak with someone, and you've always been so understanding." "Of course, my dear. Come in and sit down. You look quite distressed." Margaret twisted her handkerchief between her fingers as she spoke. "It's about Father. I've been going through his papers, trying to make sense of everything, and I found something troubling." She produced a leather-bound notebook from her handbag. "Thomas mentioned he'd seen something similar, but Lydia destroyed it. This one was hidden in Father's private safe. She doesn't know about it." The notebook contained dated entries in Richard Blackwood's firm handwriting, documenting a progressive decline in his health. The earliest entries, from 6 months ago, noted mild symptoms, occasional dizziness, slight breathlessness. But as the weeks passed, the complaints grew more serious. October 15th, another episode after evening tea. Heart racing, cold sweats. Elle says it's anxiety, but I've never been prone to nerves. November 3rd, chest pains again. Tried to call Haydock, but Elle intercepted. Says her specialist friend is better equipped to handle cardiac issues. November 20th. Found myself researching symptoms online. Everything points to digitalis poisoning. Surely not. And yet. The final entry, dated the day before his death, was the most chilling. Made appointment with toxicologist in London for tomorrow. Haven't told Elle if my suspicions are correct. God help me. He never made it to London, Margaret whispered. He died that night. Did your father ever mention anything about your stepmother's background? Only that she'd been a nurse, cardiac specialty, which is why he trusted her judgment about his health. Margaret's voice turned bitter. We thought it was rather convenient when they met at that charity function for the Heart Foundation. Now I wonder if she targeted him deliberately. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid her third visit to Thornfield Manor. She found Lydia Blackwood in the morning room, her needles working steadily through what appeared to be yet another black garment. Miss Marple, how kind of you to call again. Though I do hope this isn't becoming a habit. I'm still in mourning, you understand. Of course, my dear. I merely wanted to return your cake plate. Miss Marple held up the china dish she'd deliberately kept from her previous visit. And I must confess, I'm still fascinated by your knitting pattern. Such intricate work. Mrs. Blackwood's smile didn't reach her eyes. As I mentioned, it's a family tradition. Yes, the widow's comfort, I believe it's called, though I understand it has other names in certain parts of Wales. The clicking of needles paused almost imperceptibly. You seem remarkably well informed about Welsh knitting traditions, Miss Marple. Oh, I've always been interested in traditional crafts. They often have such fascinating histories, hidden meanings, secret purposes. Miss Marple let her words trail off suggestively. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Blackwood resumed her knitting with deliberate calm. It's simply a pattern for morning wear. Nothing more mysterious cables there. To most observers, these would appear to be simple adaptations or mistakes. But to someone who had just read Dr. Whitstable's letter, they looked suspiciously like encoded information. May I? Miss Marple reached for the work, and before Mrs. Blackwood could protest, she had lifted it for closer examination. The variations were definitely systematic. If the traditional pattern could encode herbal recipes, these modifications might represent specific formulations. I'll thank you not to handle my work, Mrs. Blackwood said sharply, snatching the shawl back. The oils from your hands could stain the wool. My apologies. I was merely admiring your technique. You must have learned from a true expert. My grandmother. She was from a small village in Gwynedd. The widow's composure had returned, but her knuckles were white around the needles. As Miss Marple left Thornfield Manor, she encountered the housemaid, Ellen, bringing in the afternoon post. Terrible atmosphere in the house these days, Ellen confided in a whisper. The children won't visit any more, and Mrs. Blackwood started locking doors that were never locked before, even her sitting room where she keeps all her knitting things. How very odd, Miss Marple murmured, though I suppose grief affects people in different ways. Grief? Ellen snorted softly. If you ask me, the only thing she's grieving is that Mr. Richard didn't have even more money to leave her. The day's final revelation came from an unexpected source. Inspector Slack appeared at Miss Marple's cottage just as she was sitting down to supper. Though you might be interested to know, he said grudgingly, we've had a response to our inquiries about Mrs. Blackwood's background. Seems she was married before, up in Cardiff. Husband died of heart failure 5 years ago. Left her quite comfortable. Indeed? And was there anything unusual about that death? Nothing that raised flags at the time. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. But here's the interesting bit. He was cremated too, at her insistence. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. Inspector, I think perhaps you should look into whether there were any other associations in Mrs. Blackwood's past. Elderly gentlemen she might have nursed, for instance. Already on it, Slack admitted. There was an old widow in Aberystwyth. Mrs. Blackwood worked as her private nurse for 6 months before the lady died. Left her a tidy sum in her will. Heart failure again. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window, working on her own knitting, a simple pattern for a child's sweater. As her needles moved rhythmically through the soft blue wool, she thought about patterns within patterns, codes within codes. The Welsh mourning pattern was ingenious in its simplicity. What better way to hide deadly knowledge than in plain sight, disguised as women's work? How many generations of women had passed down these lethal recipes, encoded in knit and purl, cable and decrease? And Lydia Blackwood had adapted the pattern for her own purposes. 3 deaths, possibly more, all attributed to heart failure, all followed by hasty cremations that destroyed any evidence, and always the widow inheriting substantially. But Richard Blackwood had been more observant than his predecessors. He had documented his symptoms, recognized the signs of poisoning, made plans to seek help. His only mistake had been underestimating how quickly his wife would act when threatened. Miss Marple's needles stilled as she noticed movement in the garden of Thornfield Manor, visible from her window. A figure in black, unmistakably Lydia Blackwood, was making her way stealthily toward the rose garden, carrying what appeared to be a small spade. Quickly donning her coat, Miss Marple slipped out into the night. By the time she reached the boundary wall of Thornfield Manor, Mrs. Blackwood had disappeared back into the house. But the freshly turned earth beneath the heritage roses told its own story. Early the next morning, before the household was stirring, Miss Marple returned to investigate. Carefully excavating the spot, she uncovered a small tin box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several packets of dried herbs and a paper covered in the same notation system she had observed in the knitting pattern. Here was the proof Inspector Slack needed. The actual recipes encoded in the traditional pattern, along with the physical ingredients for the poisons. Mrs. Blackwood had grown careless, or perhaps desperate, keeping such incriminating evidence so close to hand. As she carefully reburied the box, marking its location for the police, Miss Marple reflected that Lydia Blackwood's greatest mistake had been her consistency. The pattern of her crimes was as clear as the pattern in her knitting, and just as deadly. 3 husbands, 1 benefactress, all dead of heart failure, all cremated, all leaving their wealth to the same woman. The widow's insurance indeed. But insurance policies, Miss Marple knew, could be investigated, challenged, and ultimately revoked. Chapter 4. Midnight Visitor. The grandfather clock in Miss Marple's sitting room had just chimed 11 when she heard the urgent rapping at her door. Setting aside her knitting, a simple dishcloth pattern that required no concentration, she pulled her shawl closer and went to answer it. The sight that greeted her was alarming. Thomas Blackwood stood on her doorstep, drenched from the sudden rainstorm that had blown in after dark, his face pale with fear and his clothes dishevelled. "Miss Marple, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you at this hour, but I didn't know where else to go. I think I'm being watched." "Good heavens! Come in at once, my dear boy. You're soaked through." As she bustled about making tea and finding towels, Thomas paced her small sitting room with nervous energy. "I was in Father's study at Thornfield Manor. I still have my key, though she doesn't know it. I've been searching for any evidence that might help prove what she did to him." "And did you find something?" "More than something." From inside his wet jacket, he produced a small leather case. "There's a hidden compartment in Father's desk. Behind the bottom drawer there's a false back. Inside, I found these." He opened the case to reveal several small glass vials containing a colourless liquid, along with an envelope marked, "For Mr. Petherick, to be opened in the event of my unexpected death." Father must have suspected. He must have been collecting evidence. But before I could examine everything properly, I heard someone in the hallway. I barely managed to get out through the garden door. Did you see who it was? No, but it had to be her. The servants had all gone to bed. As I was leaving through the garden, I could swear someone was following me. I took a roundabout way here, but... He glanced nervously toward the window. You did the right thing coming here. Now, shall we see what your father wanted Mr. Petherick to know? With trembling hands, Thomas broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter in Richard Blackwood's handwriting. If you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized. For the past 6 months, I have suffered from increasingly severe symptoms that I have come to believe are the result of systematic poisoning by my wife, Lydia. It began with mild dizziness and occasional heart palpitations after our evening tea. Lydia always insisted on preparing this tea herself, claiming it contained... As my symptoms worsened, I began to research the herbs she claimed to be using. What I discovered horrified me. Many of the plants she mentioned, foxglove, lily of the valley, oleander, contain cardiac glycosides that can be fatal if improperly prepared or deliberately misused. I have managed to preserve samples of the herbal tea in the enclosed vials. Please have them analyzed immediately. I have also discovered that Lydia's previous husband died under similar circumstances, as did an elderly woman she cared for as a private nurse. I fear I may not have much time left. If anything happens to me, please ensure my children are protected and that justice is served. Yours faithfully, Richard Blackwood. The letter was dated just 2 days before his death. We must take this to Inspector Slack at once, Miss Marple said firmly. I can't. Not tonight. I'm afraid to go back out there. What if she's watching the roads? She must know by now that someone was in the study. Miss Marple considered for a moment. You're quite right to be cautious. You shall stay here tonight, and we'll speak to the inspector first thing in the morning. But first, I think I should make a telephone call. She rang her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, formerly of Scotland Yard, who was still staying with Colonel Bantry at Gossington Hall. Henry? I'm so sorry to disturb you at this late hour, but I'm afraid we have rather an urgent situation here. After explaining the circumstances, she listened intently to Sir Henry's response. Yes, I see. How very interesting. Yes, that does sound like the same woman. Thank you, Henry. Your assistance is invaluable as always. Returning to Thomas, she found him examining the vials of liquid. Sir Henry is coming over directly. He remembers a similar case in Wales about 5 years ago. A woman matching Lydia's description was investigated but never charged. Her husband had died of apparent heart failure after a brief illness. The authorities were suspicious, but without concrete evidence. Just like father, Thomas said bitterly. Exactly. But this time, we have evidence. Miss Marple gestured toward the vials. Your father was very clever to preserve these samples. Within the hour, Sir Henry arrived, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, whom he had roused on the way. The doctor examined the vials with professional interest. These need proper laboratory analysis, of course, but even from the smell, yes, there's definitely something here that shouldn't be in herbal tea. Foxglove, I'd say, and perhaps something else. Lily of the valley? Both contain cardiac glycosides, Sir Henry noted. In the right dosage, they could mimic a natural heart attack. Devilishly clever. What's truly diabolical, Miss Marple added, is how she encoded the recipes in her knitting patterns. The Welsh tradition of the widow's comfort was already associated with death and mourning. She simply adapted it to include actual formulas for poison. Sir Henry's expression grew grave. I've been making some inquiries since your call. The woman I remembered from Wales, her name was Lydia Morgan then. The pattern fits. She marries older men with money. They develop heart problems. They die. She inherits. Always the grieving widow. Always above suspicion. Until now, Thomas said fiercely. We can stop her now, can't we? We need to proceed carefully, Sir Henry cautioned. These vials are evidence, but we need to connect them definitively to Mrs. Blackwood. The knitting pattern is circumstantial at best. Miss Marple had been thinking quietly. There may be a way. If we could examine her current knitting project, the one she's working on now, and compare it to the formula suggested by the herbs in these vials. But how do we get access to her knitting? Thomas asked. Leave that to me, Miss Marple said with a slight smile. I believe I'll pay another call on Mrs. Blackwood tomorrow. After all, one knitter to another, it's only natural I should be interested in her work. Just then, the telephone rang. It was Ellen, the housemaid from Thornfield Manor, her voice trembling with fear. Miss Marple, I'm sorry to ring so late, but something terrible has happened. Mrs. Blackwood discovered someone had been in the master's study. She's in a right state, accusing all the servants. And then she asked me to prepare tea for Mr. James Blackwood. Said he was coming by to discuss family matters in the morning. The way she said it, Miss Marple, it gave me chills. Ellen, listen carefully. Has Mrs. Blackwood prepared any special herbs tonight? Yes, miss. She was in the still room earlier, mixing something. Said it was for her nerves, but you don't believe her. No, miss. It smelled just like the tea she used to make for the master. After Ellen hung up, Miss Marple turned to the others with urgency. We haven't much time. She knows someone has discovered her secret. James Blackwood may be her next victim, a way to eliminate the most vocal opponent to her inheritance. Sir Henry immediately telephoned Inspector Slack, while Dr. Haydock prepared to analyze the vials more thoroughly. Thomas was assigned to warn his brother, though reaching James proved difficult as he wasn't answering his telephone. As the night wore on, Miss Marple found herself thinking about patterns again. Lydia Blackwood had followed the same pattern with each murder. Befriend, marry, poison slowly, inherit. But now that pattern was broken. Someone had invaded her sanctuary, discovered her secrets. Like a spider whose web has been disturbed, she would either flee or strike quickly. The morning brought dramatic developments. James Blackwood had indeed visited Thornfield Manor for tea with his stepmother. Within an hour, he had collapsed with symptoms alarmingly similar to those that had preceded his father's death. If Dr. Haydock hadn't arrived in time with his medical bag and activated charcoal, the outcome might have been very different. As James was rushed to hospital, Inspector Slack finally took action. The vials from Richard Blackwood's study tested positive for dangerous levels of cardiac glycosides. A search warrant for Thornfield Manor was obtained, and the police descended on the house. They found Lydia Blackwood in her sitting room, calmly knitting. The needles never stopped their rhythmic clicking, even as Inspector Slack read her the charges. Lydia Blackwood, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Richard Blackwood and the attempted murder of James Blackwood. You are also to be questioned regarding the deaths of your previous husband, Dafydd Morgan, and Mrs. Gwyneth Price of Aberystwyth. How fascinating, Lydia said coolly. And what evidence do you think you have? Your late husband preserved samples of the poison you were feeding him. We also have his written testimony, documenting his suspicions. For the first time, the knitting needles stilled. Richard was more observant than I gave him credit for. Most men don't notice what's right in front of them. Like your knitting pattern. Miss Marple stepped forward. The one that encodes recipes for poison? I believe if we examine your current project, we'll find it contains the exact formula for the mixture you gave James Blackwood this morning." Lydia's composure finally cracked. Her face contorted with rage as she realized how thoroughly she had been discovered. "You meddling old woman! What do you know about it? About what it's like?" "She taught me to be prepared. The men in our village lived dangerous lives in the mines. Many women were left widows. Some had the foresight to prepare for the inevitable. The wise ones ensured they were left comfortable when that day came. But your husbands weren't miners facing daily danger," Sir Henry interjected. "They were innocent men who trusted you." "Innocent?" "Richard was planning to disinherit his own children before he met me. He was a cold, calculating man who happened to meet someone more calculating. As for innocent ... She laughed bitterly. "No wealthy man is innocent. They all step on others to get what they want. I simply made sure I got what I wanted first." As the police led her away, still defiant, Miss Marple picked up the unfinished knitting from the chair. The pattern was indeed a formula, one that matched precisely with the poison given to James Blackwood. "To think," Dr. Haydock mused, "all that deadly knowledge hidden in something as innocent as knitting." "Evil often hides behind the most ordinary facades," Miss Marple replied, "but patterns will always reveal themselves to those who know how to look." 3 weeks later, James Blackwood had recovered fully, and the family's fortune was in the process of being restored to its rightful heirs. Lydia Blackwood awaited trial for multiple murders, with evidence mounting as investigators uncovered more suspicious deaths in her past. Miss Marple sat in her garden, working on a new knitting project, a cheerful yellow cardigan for her great-niece. As her needles clicked in the familiar rhythm, she reflected that patterns could serve good or evil, depending on the hands that created them. The important thing was to recognize the difference and act accordingly. The cardigan would be finished in time for Christmas, its pattern carrying nothing more sinister than love and warmth. As for the widow's comfort, it would soon take its place in criminal history, a reminder that the most dangerous secrets can hide in plain sight, disguised as something as innocent as a grandmother's craft. Chapter 5. The Inspector's Doubt. Inspector Slack sat in Miss Marple's cottage 3 days after Lydia Blackwood's arrest, his expression one of frustrated concern. Despite the dramatic events at Thornfield Manor, he seemed far from satisfied. "The trouble is," he said, accepting a cup of tea with uncharacteristic politeness, "we haven't got enough for a murder conviction. Not for Richard Blackwood's death, anyway." "But surely the vials of poison, the letter, James Blackwood's testimony, all very compelling, Miss Marple. But any decent barrister would tear it apart. The vials prove Richard suspected poisoning, but not that he was actually poisoned. His letter is supposition, not evidence, and with the body cremated, we can't prove cause of death." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "What about the attempted murder of James?" "That's our strongest case. Dr. Haydock got there in time to take blood samples before treatment. The lab found significant levels of digitalis, enough to trigger cardiac arrest. But Mrs. Blackwood's solicitor is already claiming it was a terrible mistake, that James must have accidentally ingested some of her heart medication." "Preposterous." "Of course it is. But juries want proof beyond reasonable doubt. Right now, we've got suspicious circumstances and one clear attempted murder. The Crown prosecutor says it might not be enough." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her sharp mind working. "Inspector, perhaps we're approaching this wrong. Instead of trying to prove what we can't, the specific murder of Richard Blackwood, we should establish a pattern of behavior." "How do you mean?" "Lydia Blackwood has left a trail of deaths behind her. If we can document that pattern, show the consistency of method, The repeated financial gains? Well, patterns tell their own story. Slack looked interested despite himself. Go on. You mentioned her previous marriage in Wales. What about the elderly woman she nursed? Mrs. Gwyneth Price died 6 years ago in Aberystwyth. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. Left Mrs. Blackwood, then Morgan, £10,000. And was there an autopsy? Number. The woman was 87, under a doctor's care for heart problems. Nothing suspicious at the time. But in light of recent events? Slack nodded slowly. I've already contacted the Welsh authorities. They're reviewing the case. And there's something else. We've found a connection to another death. A Mr. Harold Westbrook in Brighton 3 years ago. Widower, wealthy, died of heart failure after a brief illness. His housekeeper mentioned a Welsh nurse who'd been especially attentive in his final months. Was anything left to this nurse? £5,000 for exceptional care and comfort. The housekeeper remembered her as a skilled knitter who was always working on some complicated pattern. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, needles clicking thoughtfully. 4 deaths, Inspector. All wealthy, all with heart conditions that developed after Mrs. Blackwood's arrival, all leaving her money. That's not coincidence. That's methodology. But we still can't prove murder without bodies to examine. Perhaps not. But there's another angle to consider. The knitting pattern itself, the widow's comfort, or the widow's insurance. If we could prove it actually contains encoded poison recipes. Slack looked skeptical. You really think a jury would buy that? Secret poison formulas hidden in knitting patterns? I've been corresponding with Dr. Whitstable at the British Museum. Miss Marple continued calmly. She's prepared to testify as an expert witness about the historical use of such patterns. Furthermore, if we compare the specific variations in Mrs. Blackwood's patterns with known herbal formulae. She was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, looking excited. I've just come from the hospital. James Blackwood is recovering well, and he's remembered something important. The tea Lydia served him. He noticed it had an unusual taste, slightly bitter. He mentioned it, and she said it was a new blend from Wales, good for the constitution. The same thing she told Richard, Slack noted. Exactly. But here's the interesting part. James saw her knitting while they talked. He particularly noticed she kept referring to her pattern, counting stitches in a way that seemed oddly intense. At one point, she even made what he thought was a mistake, pulled out several rows and redid them. He remembered thinking it strange that she was so concerned with perfection during what was supposedly a conciliatory meeting. Miss Marple leaned forward. She was checking the formula, making sure she had the proportions right. It's still circumstantial, Slack said, but he sounded less certain. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a telegram from Dr. Whitstable. Have decoded pattern variations. Stop corresponds exactly to formula combining digitalis, purpurea, and convalaria majalis. Stop lethal in prescribed doses. Stop will testify. Stop Whitstable. Armed with this information, Inspector Slack obtained a warrant to search Lydia Blackwood's belongings more thoroughly. In her rooms at Thornfield Manor, they discovered several completed knitting projects, each showing the telltale variations that Dr. Whitstable had identified. Of poison preparations. Look here, he pointed out to Slack. These dates correspond to the deaths we're investigating, and these notes about harvesting and preparation, they're not about vegetables. Foxglove, oleander, lily of the valley, all cardiac poisons. The forensic team also found traces of various toxic plants in the still room at Thornfield Manor, along with equipment for creating concentrated extracts. As evidence mounted, Lydia Blackwood's solicitor requested a meeting. She wished, he said, to make a statement. In the bare interview room at the police station, Lydia sat straight-backed and composed, her hands folded as if holding invisible knitting needles. "I wish to clarify certain matters," she began. "Not to confess. Confession implies wrongdoing, but to explain. The pattern I used, the widow's insurance, has been in my family for generations. My grandmother taught it to me, as her grandmother taught her. It's a tradition among Welsh women who understood that sometimes survival requires preparation." "Preparation for murder?" Slack asked bluntly. "Preparation for independence, for freedom." "My grandmother watched her mother waste away, tied to a brutal man who drank away their money and beat her nightly. She vowed her daughters would never suffer the same fate. The pattern was women's wisdom, passed down through generations who had no legal recourse, no escape from bad marriages except widowhood." "But your victims weren't abusive husbands," Miss Marple interjected softly. "They were simply wealthy men who trusted you." Lydia's eyes flashed. Were they? Richard Blackwood made his fortune exploiting workers, paying minimum wages while he lived in luxury. My first husband inherited wealth built on Welsh miners' broken backs. Mrs. Price's money came from slumlords who let children freeze in winter. Clean hands don't accumulate that kind of wealth, Miss Marple. So Slate looked skeptical. "You're claiming this was some sort of social justice?" "I'm claiming it was survival. Women of my grandmother's generation had no power, no rights, no escape. The pattern gave them a chance at freedom. I simply adapted it to modern circumstances." "By becoming a serial killer," Slack said flatly, "by ensuring I would never be dependent on any man's whims, by taking control of my own destiny." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "And James Blackwood? He's young, has earned nothing yet. What was his crime?" For the first time, Lydia looked uncomfortable. "He was going to challenge the will, take away everything I'd worked for. I couldn't allow that." "So it was just about money after all," Slack concluded. "It was about power," Lydia corrected. "Money is just how power is measured in this world." The interview ended, but Lydia's partial admissions, combined with the mounting physical evidence, sealed her fate. The Crown Prosecution Service decided to proceed with charges for the attempted murder of James Blackwood and the murders of Harold Westbrook and Gwyneth Price, where evidence was strongest. As the legal machinery ground into motion, Miss Marple found herself visiting an elderly Welsh woman in a nursing home, Mrs. Bronwyn Evans, who had grown up in the same village as Lydia's grandmother. "Oh, yes, I remember the Morgan family," Mrs. Evans said, her ancient fingers working on her own knitting. "Always a bit apart from the rest of us. There were stories about that pattern they passed down. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was women's protection against cruel fate." "Did you know it contained actual poison recipes?" Mrs. Evans's needles never paused. "We all knew there was something dark about it. But in those days, in those mountains, women needed whatever protection they could find. The pattern was power for the powerless. I suppose it's fitting it should end in a courtroom rather than being passed to another generation." The trial of Lydia Blackwood would become one of the most sensational of the decade. The combination of modern forensics and ancient folklore, of knitting patterns and deadly poisons, captured the public imagination. Dr. Whitstable's testimony about the historical pattern proved riveting, especially when she demonstrated how specific stitch combinations corresponded to precise measurements of toxic herbs. But before all that would come to pass, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, working on a simple pattern for a child's hat. Inspector Slack, had stopped by to thank her for her assistance. Without your insight about looking for patterns rather than single incidents, we might never have built a strong enough case, he admitted grudgingly. Patterns are everywhere, Inspector. In knitting, in nature, in human behavior. The trick is knowing which ones lead to warmth and comfort, and which ones lead to death. As Slack departed, Miss Marple reflected on the long shadow cast by the widow's comfort. How many women through the centuries had used that knowledge? How many deaths had been attributed to natural causes when they were anything but? The pattern would die with Lydia Blackwood. No one left to pass it to, its dark secrets finally exposed to the light. She picked up her needles again, working the soft wool into something innocent and warm. Better to create patterns of love, she thought, than to perpetuate patterns of death. Though she couldn't help wondering how many other dark secrets lay hidden in the seemingly innocent traditions passed down through generations, waiting for someone observant enough to decode their true meaning. Chapter 6. Justice Served. The drawing room at Miss Marple's cottage was unusually crowded that October afternoon. Inspector Slack occupied the most comfortable chair, while Sir Henry Clithering stood by the mantelpiece. The three Blackwood siblings, James, Margaret, and Thomas, sat together on the sofa, and Mr. Petherick, the family solicitor, had taken the window seat. Dr. Haydock perched on a footstool near the fire, and Miss Marple herself sat in her usual chair, her knitting temporarily set aside. They were all waiting for Lydia Blackwood, whom Miss Marple had invited for what she'd described as a discussion about Welsh knitting traditions. The invitation had been carefully worded, an elderly spinster's innocent request to document a historical craft pattern before the trial made such conversations impossible. "Are you sure she'll come?" James asked nervously. He still looked pale from his recent ordeal. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Mrs. Blackwood's pride in her family's traditions is quite genuine. She won't be able to resist the opportunity to demonstrate her superior knowledge one last time." As if on cue, they heard footsteps on the garden path. But when the door opened, it admitted not only Lydia Blackwood, but also Dr. Haydock's colleague, Nurse Williams, who had been caring for James. "Ah, excellent timing," Miss Marple said. "Now we can begin." Lydia looked around the room, her eyes narrowing as she took in the assembled group. "This isn't what I expected, Miss Marple. I thought this was to be a private conversation about knitting." "In a way it is," Miss Marple replied. "Please do sit down. I've been very interested in your unique pattern. The widow's comfort, or, as I've learned it's sometimes called, the widow's insurance." Lydia's hands tightened on her handbag. "I see you've done your research." "Indeed." "That's pure speculation," Lydia said coldly. "Actually, it's not," Dr. Haydock interjected. "The analysis of the tea you served James matches exactly with the formula encoded in the pattern you were knitting that day." Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and produced a detailed chart. "Let me show you what we've discovered. The traditional widow's comfort pattern originated in the mining communities of Gwynedd, where women developed a secret code to share knowledge about medicinal, and sometimes toxic, herbs. The pattern used various stitches to represent different plants and quantities. Your grandmother, Morfydd Morgan, was one of the last known practitioners of this craft. According to parish records, at least 3 men in her village died of heart failure after marrying widows who were seen knitting this pattern before their husbands' deaths. "Ancient history," Lydia said dismissively. "Perhaps, but you modernized it brilliantly. Where your ancestors used local herbs, you cultivated specific cardiac glycosides. Where they relied on imprecise measurements, You developed a system where each knit stitch represented a precise milligram, each pearl a specific ratio of ingredients. Miss Marple pointed to her chart. This variation here, 3 knits, 2 pearls, cable twist, translates to 3 milligrams of digitalis purpurea combined with 2 milligrams of convallaria majalis. Exactly what was found in Richard's last cup of tea. You can't prove that, Lydia maintained, though her composure was beginning to crack. Actually, we can, said Nurse Williams, stepping forward. You see, Mrs. Blackwood, while everyone was focused on the cremation preventing analysis of Richard's body, they overlooked something else. The teacup he was drinking from when he died was preserved by the maid, Ellen. She thought it was strange that you insisted on washing up immediately after his death, so she kept that one cup as a memento of her employer. And we had it tested, Inspector Slack added with satisfaction. Perfect match to your formula. Lydia's face went white. That's impossible. I destroyed... She stopped, realizing what she'd admitted. Destroyed the evidence? Yes, you thought you had, Miss Marple said gently. But evil has a way of leaving traces, no matter how careful one is. Your mistake was in being too consistent. The same pattern with each victim, the same method, the same heart failure on death certificates. We've documented 11 suspicious deaths over the past 15 years, Sir Henry announced. All connected to you, all involving substantial inheritances, all preceded by your distinctive knitting pattern. 11? Thomas gasped. Oh, yes, Miss Marple confirmed. Mrs. Blackwood was nothing if not industrious. The pattern served her well until she met Richard, who was more observant than her previous victims. He began documenting his symptoms, collecting evidence. Father knew, Margaret whispered. He suspected, and that signed his death warrant. When Lydia discovered he planned to see a toxicologist in London, she had to act quickly. The final dose was much stronger than usual, strong enough to overcome any tolerance he might have built up. Lydia stood suddenly. This is all conjecture, historical speculation about knitting patterns. You'll never make it stand up in court. Actually, Mr. Petherick spoke for the first time. I believe we will. You see, this afternoon, while you've been here, the police have been executing a search warrant at your mother's house in Wales. They've found her journals, detailed records of the family tradition, including specific formulas and a list of successful applications going back 50 years. No! Lydia's composure finally shattered. Those journals were hidden. No one could have... Your cousin Bronwyn told us where to look, Inspector Slack said. Apparently she never approved of the family tradition. She's been waiting years for someone to ask the right questions. Lydia sank back into her chair, defeated. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of Miss Marple's clock. It's over, Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Marple said quietly. The pattern has been broken. Lydia looked up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and strange pride. You think you're so clever, don't you? The harmless old spinster who sees everything. But you've never been trapped, have you? Never been powerless, dependent on the whims of men who see you as property or servant or decoration. No, Miss Marple agreed. I've been fortunate, but I've also seen how bitterness can poison a soul far more thoroughly than any herb. The women in my family found a way to fight back against a world that gave them no power, no choices. The pattern was our weapon, our protection. Your weapon became murder, Sir Henry said firmly, and you didn't target abusive husbands seeking freedom. You hunted wealthy men for their money. Power is power, Lydia said defiantly. Men have always used it against women. I simply turned the tables. Inspector Slack stood. Lydia Blackwood, I'm arresting you for the murders of Richard Blackwood, Harold Westbrook, Gwyneth Price. He continued through the list of 11 names, while Lydia sat motionless, her hands clasped as if around invisible knitting needles. As she was led away, she paused at the door. The pattern will die with me, she told Miss Marple. I have no daughters to pass it to. Perhaps that's for the best. The world has changed. Women have other weapons now. After she was gone, the room seemed to exhale collectively. James, Margaret, and Thomas embraced, their family fortune soon to be restored, their father's death finally explained, if not justified. I must thank you, Miss Marple, James said. Without your insight about the knitting pattern, I've always believed that the truth reveals itself to those who look carefully enough, Miss Marple replied, picking up her own knitting, a cheerful pair of mittens in bright red wool. Though I must say, this case has rather put me off complex cable patterns for a while. 3 months later, Lydia Blackwood was convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The trial revealed the full scope of her crimes, dating back to her first victim, an elderly aunt who had taught her the fatal pattern. The Blackwood siblings donated the infamous knitting pattern to the British Museum, where it joined Dr. Whitstable's collection of historical textiles with a carefully worded warning about its deadly purpose. Miss Marple continued her knitting, creating warm, loving items for friends and family. But occasionally, when working on a particularly complex pattern, she would pause and reflect on how human ingenuity could serve either good or evil purposes, and how the most dangerous secrets often hide behind the most innocent facades. The last Miss Marple heard, Bronwyn Morgan had burned her family's journals and taken up crochet instead. Some traditions, she declared, were better left buried in the past. The widow's comfort had claimed its last victim, its deadly secret finally unraveled by an elderly spinster who understood that in knitting, as in life, every stitch tells a story, and some stories are written in blood. The case of the knitting widow would go down in the annals of St. Mary Mead as one of Miss Marple's most intricate investigations, a reminder that evil can lurk in the most domestic of settings, and that sometimes the deadliest weapons are those passed down through generations under the guise of innocent tradition.